What is your uh, explanation for wokeness? Where did it come from, according to your analysis?
Well, yeah, so I take a sort of somewhat different approach than some of the others in this burgeoning field of woke studies. No,
Yeah.
but essentially, the origins, I'm tracing the origins to left liberalism and not to communism, to this idea of a sort of Marcusian turn from class to identity to make revolution. I'm not saying that's not important for at the intellectual elite level, and in providing some of the vocabulary that we see, like whiteness and critical race theory. But mainly, what I'm interested in is this humanitarian liberalism, where you're starting to crank that humanitarian dial up more and more and more as applied to identity groups. This kind of begins in the early 20th century with the liberal progressive movement, which combines a kind of broadly left wing orientation on social welfare with a sort of anti traditional orientation to the dominant WASP culture in America. That whole idea of being liberal and progressive was actually a new combination in the early 20th century. Prior to that, the progressive movement was actually what we might consider quite nationally conservative. So
Mm.
in the end of the 19th, early 20th century, it believed in, temperance, prohibiting the sale of alcohol, believed in immigration restriction, quite
Eugenics,
anti-Catholic.
even.
Well, yeah, eugenics. Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, eugenics fits kind of oddly because it's sort of, yeah, but you're right. Actually, eugenics was part of that mix. And it's not until we get into that early 20th century that we get this relativism coming in and a more liberal progressive approach. Now, that's kind of the beginning. And I think a lot of people focus when they talk about social democracy or the soft left or left liberalism, they're always talking about the economy. And yes, on the economy, it's moderate. It's between communism and capitalism. It's about a mixed
Mm.
economy, which most people would say was kind of the right way to go. But on culture, unbounded on its left. So really didn't really have any set limits to the idea of how sort of sensitive, how diverse, how much equality should we have between on the sex or race front. There was no real limits on that. And now for a long time, liberal progressivism, it was concerned mainly with European immigrants and Catholic and Jewish vis-a-vis the Anglo-Protestant majority. Now, it was, I would say, reasonably mild. I mean, it was in favor of loosening immigration and so on, but and it was mildly pluralist as opposed to assimilationist. But this wasn't extreme. We then hit the late 60s, mid 60s, and we get what I consider to be the big bang of our moral order, which is the rise of the race taboo, the anti racism taboo. And now I think many people would agree that it was a good thing to have a norm against racism, but what we get is a binary tripwire where if you're accused of this thing, you become radioactive. And that happens all of a sudden. Commentators at the time, like Shelby Steele, who's African American conservative who lived through Jim Crow, and he talks about the cultural power shifting almost on a dime
Mm.
from, blacks having to genuflect to whites having to genuflect to blacks, at least in polite circles. And Paul Krugman of the New York Times, relates this story about people suddenly repainting all the black coachmen on their front gates in the well-off areas to white just one summer. So this is a sort of very much a critical juncture, and I think it sets our moral order.
So on that point, your knowledge of the relevant data is better than mine. But my understanding is that if you track metrics of racism, such as the percentage of white people who would be willing to vote for a black president or who are in favor of interracial marriage, things like that, that you don't see a sharp drop. You see a sort of more continuous decline. Is that right? And
Yeah,
how does
that's
that fit in
absolutely
with your thesis?
so. That's absolutely correct, and not only that, yeah. So we can take a few metrics. In the 40s, almost half of white Americans agreed with the statement: a white person should have the first chance at any kind of job. That's our starting point, right? Um, between the sort of 1940s and the early 60s, we already see quite a bit of movement in attitudes. And in fact, there were certain things that were said. I did a survey of people over 75 on a crowdsourced platform, not a large sample, but um, people were saying that already in the 50s, you had nursery rhymes that used the N word that was being phased out, catch a tigger by their toe instead of
Yeah.
the N word. So that kind of thing was already occurring prior to the civil rights movement. But then the civil rights movement seems to have galvanized and created this sudden sacredness. Now, the first thing to say is that's probably happening more at the level of arts and letters and elites.
Mm.
In the mass of the population, clearly, there were, still black families being intimidated out of neighborhoods when they went in and tried to sort of move in. That was happening even in the, I think, well, mainly in the 60s, but there were even some incidents going into the early 80s of that. So clearly at the mass level, this was percolating. But at the level of respectable society and the mass culture, I think it was very dramatic.